Okay, we're going to talk about how to mark the blocks and cut the blocks through the Reflections quilt. The great thing about this quilt, you're only piecing the center blocks. So once you get this piecing done, it's just a 9 patch. So to mark the registration points for cutting, for these center pieces, this is B and C, really you're just finding the midpoint first. So instead of measuring over, you can just finger press and get your midpoint. On both of these center pieces. And then for these side pieces, we're going to mark those. And I'm also going to mark this dot up here. It's just 1/4 inch in and 1/4 inch down. I find that easiest just to measure from the opposite side. So look at the measurement of this and just go 1/4 inch over on each side and then mark a dot. I usually would not use a marker this big, but I'm just doing this so you can see it on the video. Now for this, let me just go ahead and move these two out of the way. For pieces A and A, these are marked differently. This one, you measure down and 1/4 inch over. And mark that, and all these measurements are in the pattern. And then again, this side's just 1/4 inch over and 1/4 inch down. And you can probably just eyeball it if you want. This one is slightly different, and it's, sorry for the darker fabric. So 1/4 inch over, 1/4 inch down to mark. Oops, sorry, not that one. This one's different. It's 1/4 inch over, 2 inches down. And then you mark this point down here. At this point, you're going to use your everyday curve templates, and we're going to piece together the right side with the top first. So this is going to be the convex side, this is going to be the concave side, so make sure you use the correct template. Now what might be kind of odd, it doesn't matter where this template goes, all that matters is that this seam line here meets the 2 dots. So that's done. This, you're going to use the concave, and again it's all about the seam lines, and I marked the center here, but you're going to try matching 1/4 inch up on that center line. So I'll go ahead and put a dot there so you have something to look at. I'm just going to turn this to make it easier for me to cut, and again I'm just looking at the seam line, and I want it to meet the 2 dots, so just adjust it. It doesn't matter where it lies as long as it falls on those 2 dots. So those two are ready to piece. Now let me bring this back. And again, I marked the center with a finger pressing. Now I want to just go 1/4 inch down. I'm just going to eyeball it, it's fine. Now this one's a little different. You want the seam line, so this line right here, to cross that dot, and then down on this corner, you just want the edge of the template to come into the corner. Right there. So that's on the dot, the seam line's on the dot, the edge of the template meets the corner. And then this is the concave side. I'm just going to turn it so I can see. And again, it's just the seam line is going to cross this dot and that dot. And it's really hard to see on this dark fabric. And now these are ready to piece. To piece these two, I'm not going to, it's such a short line, I'm not even going to use a midpoint. I'll just put these right sides together, and using that little pink vinyl strip that came with your templates, I can check to make sure this V right here is at 1/4 of an inch. And then I'll just move this into place as I sew. And then here, I probably will mark the center in that case. Again, that V needs to be 1/4 of an inch in from the seam. And I'll just mark the center there. And then this one I want to mark the opposite way. So again, that V happens at 1/4 of an inch. I'll finger press it. I'll turn it so it's right sides together, or right sides up, and then flip them. And in this case, I'll match that center first, pin it, and then come over here and pin that, making sure that V, again, is at 1/4 of an inch in from the seam, from the cut line. Concave side, it will use piece B. This is the convex side. We'll cut it with piece A. So we're going to start with this side first. And I'm just going to put these right sides together and match them down at this corner. I don't worry too much about that. That's going to just be hard to finagle. And then I want to mark a reference point, 1/4 of an inch in, 1/4 of an inch up. You can eyeball it if you feel confident, you know, 1/4 of an inch. You can use a ruler. You can just, you know, use a ruler, come 1/4 of an inch in, 1/4 of an inch up. Then you're going to take your template, and sorry, I'm cutting left-handed. You can flip it all over to be right-handed. And you want this Drunkard's path line along this fold and this reference point on this seam line all at the same time. So once you get, I find it easiest to line this up and move it up. Alternatively, you could line this up and pivot on that until you get this, but it's imperative that this dotted line, the Drunkard's path line, lines up with that fold, while this seam line crosses that dot. Okay, there's the first side. Now for the second side. It's very similar. I'm going to take this, fold it in half, lining these two seams up. Again, it doesn't really matter if it's okay on that side. And this one's a little easier because you don't even have to mark a reference point. You just need the Drunkard's path line on the fold and the corner meeting the edge of the template meeting the corner. So once you have it in place, now to stitch it, you can do a few things. You could match the midpoints. I have them matched already just because the way I fold, actually I don't quite have them matched. When you find the midpoint, actually these are okay. So you can use the midpoint here, and I'll refold this to have the midpoint the opposite way. You don't have to worry about the V on these because they all come flat. And you can match them that way. I find it more important to match these two seams. So I'll just go 1/4 of an inch in and stick a pin in on this side. and then go 1/4 inch in on that side. Get these pretty straight, and then pin it. That works best for me to get those two to match. And then again, I went ahead and put my pink strip. You should have gotten this, you would have gotten this pink strip with your template set. I have mine on my sewing machine bed. I just put one here just for demonstration purposes. So when I do this, I want my cut edge right here because that's 1/4 inch in on my machine. And then I'm going to take this, match the raw edges together, and where they intersected that V needs to be 1/4 inch in. So that's how we use this. And then I just pin that enough to get it started. I'll put this on my machine, put down a stitch or two, remove this pin, stitch all the way down, and then when I remove this pin, that's when I'll go ahead and match the other end, and I'll match it on my machine in the same manner. This one actually comes, because these are flat, this one will match flat, so you don't even need that 1/4 inch offset. So here's the final block. You may find that this point looks better with the seam open or to one side. I think if I press this open it would look a little better. It is pretty well matched though. And you may find that this has drawn up a little more than you would like, but usually it's well enough, it's large enough that you can make it work just fine. What you can try is taking a little less on your seam allowance, so using a scant 1/4 inch. I find that when I use batiks like I'm using today, it's a little harder to get these pressed as flat, and the seam allowance just seems to take up a little more room. So this one is a little bit, it's like it's 1/8 of an inch short up and down, but I'm going to deal with that because my side pieces measure the same size as this, so I'll use my side pieces to just get this back in the square. So again, I find that most problematic with batiks just because they don't seem to have as much give. And again, that's seam allowance, and I find that anytime I use batiks, the seam allowance just takes up a little more room. So if your block is measuring a little small, I would try using a smaller, slightly smaller seam allowance or a thinner thread. Both of those can help. You could also try pressing your seams open to get that. The other thing with our ruler is you don't have to clip your seam lines. And on this block, I always press to the larger piece. So since this is the larger piece, I go this way. Since this is the larger piece, I go this way. And same with here. Here's my larger piece, so I go down here. I find it a lot easier because I really don't want that bulk in these seam allowances. So that's kind of why I go that way.